Welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Veronica and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please check below to see if you've subscribed to our channel. It's 100% free and just allows our stories to pop up on your feed more often. A fleet of human supercarriers approached the Frizerian home world, spelling imminent defeat. Empress Redora stood on the raised platform at the core of the House of Nobles, her gaze sweeping over the gathered aristocracy. Only hours ago, they had strutted about with arrogant confidence. Now they huddled together, fear etched into their icy features, fear they had never displayed during their warmongering speeches. The massive screen above her head displayed tactical information, the approaching human fleet represented by ominous red markers against the darkness of space. As the nobles whispered frantically among themselves, Redora caught a glimpse of her reflection on one of the polished surfaces nearby. She stared at herself, a being of coldness with hair so white it hurt to look at it, skin pale as fresh snow, features sharp and regal. The embodiment of a cold ice queen. But behind that perfect exterior, she saw something else. Exhaustion. Awareness that penetrated to her core after years of maintaining this facade, the weight of an empire she had never truly wanted to rule. Empress Redora, Noble Yetar's voice cut through the chamber, trembling slightly. We must immediately discuss evacuation protocols for the ruling class, the humans. The humans? Redora repeated, her voice deceptively soft. The chamber fell silent, nobles freezing in place. The humans you assured me were a primitive species? The humans you claimed would crumble at the first sign of Frizerian superiority? Those humans? For months, the nobles had pushed her towards this war, a convenient distraction from domestic issues, from the commoners who had been close to rebellion after generations of noble incompetence and exploitation. Engage the humans in conflict. Our internal problems will solve themselves, they had promised. The citizens will unite behind their empress against this new threat. Something broke inside her. For the first time since her coronation as a full youngster, Redora felt the icy control she had maintained for so long crack and shatter. How fascinating, she continued, her voice gaining volume, that the nobles of House Lozen suddenly appear concerned. Weren't you the ones who dismissed my questions about human military capabilities? Who laughed when I suggested more reconnaissance? Noble Lozen stepped forward, his pale face twitching with indignation. Your Majesty, this is hardly the time for— For what? Redora cut him off. For truth? For acknowledging your catastrophic miscalculation? For remembering how you manipulated me into this war while promising it would solve all our internal problems? The nobles stared at her in shock. She had never spoken to them this way before. Your Majesty, another noble began, your tone is most inappropriate given the— Inappropriate? Redora screamed, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. The word hung in the air, a shocking breach of royal protocol. You dare speak to me of appropriateness while our world faces annihilation? She stepped forward, the hem of her silver gown sweeping across the platform. For once in my life, I will be my true self. I have nothing left to lose with humanity's fleet approaching. She turned to Noble Yetter, her eyes narrowing. Your house embezzled military funds for 3 generations, leaving our orbital defenses outdated and undermanned. Yet you vacationed on the pleasure moons while claiming your budget constraints. Before Yetar could respond, she pivoted to Lozen. And you convinced the council to reject the human peace proposal 6 months ago, claiming it was beneath Frizerian dignity to negotiate. Was it beneath your dignity, or did your weapons manufacturing interests require conflict? One by one, she exposed their hypocrisy, their schemes, their petty rivalries that had culminated in this moment. Decades of frustration poured out of her in a torrent of accusations, mockery, and unvarnished truth. When Noble Lozen attempted to interrupt, his face contorted with outrage, Redora abandoned all pretense of decorum. "Silence, you pathetic frost worms!" she hissed, using the most offensive Fraserian insult reserved for the lowest criminals. "Your bloodline is as thin as your courage and as corrupt as your ethics. You would sacrifice every commoner on this planet before risking a single hair on your parasitic offspring." Gasps echoed through the chamber. No Empress had ever spoken such words to the noble houses. In stunned silence that followed, Redora looked around at their horrified faces, at their disbelief that she would dare speak to them this way. For a brief moment, a strange calm washed over her. Perhaps their species deserved extinction. At least then she would be relieved of all her burdens. The thought brought a fleeting sense of peace. It didn't last long. This is treason!" Noble Yetter finally sputtered, his composure shattered. "Treason?" Redora laughed bitterly. "Against whom?" "You dishonor your position," another noble called out. "In our darkest hour, you turn against your own kind." The accusations mounted, exactly as she had expected. Disrespect, abandonment, treason against the Fraserian people. But then, the tide of accusations took an unexpected turn. "Citizens of Fraseria," Noble Lozen blocked her own communication and called out, not to those present, but to the broadcast system that transmitted these proceedings across the planet. "You witness a terrible truth today. Your Empress had led us to destruction." Redora froze, unable to believe what she was hearing. "It was Her Majesty who insisted on provoking the humans." Noble Yetter joined in smoothly. "We counseled restraint, but she was determined to prove Fraserian superiority." One by one, the nobles joined this coordinated assault, rewriting history before her eyes. Private conversations where they had pressured her into war were now portrayed in reverse. In their telling, she became the warmonger, they the voices of reason she had ignored. This will never work, Redora thought. The citizens knew better. They had sensed the nobles beating the drums of war for months. But as the massive screens around the chamber began displaying citizens' reactions from across the planet, her confidence crumbled. Somehow, their strategy was working. From the most remote rural settlements to the densely populated urban centers, Fraserians were calling for her removal. "The Empress has betrayed us! She brought the humans to our doorstep! Remove her before she destroys us all!" The realization struck Redora like a physical blow. The nobles had been preparing for this moment, laying the groundwork to make her the scapegoat if their gamble failed. And the citizens, desperate for someone to blame, were accepting this obvious lie. As the world figuratively crumbled around her, it began to literally shake as well. Distant explosions, the first human strikes reaching the planet's surface, rattled the windows of the noble house. "We must act decisively," Noble Lozen announced, his voice steady now that he had seized control. "By the ancient laws of Fraseria, when an empress endangers our people, she may be removed." "I call for a vote of the noble houses," Yetar added, "to banish Empress Redora to the cold and to inform the humans that this war was her doing alone, that Fraseria surrender and begs for mercy." The vote was swift and unanimous. Before Redora could fully process what was happening, security guards, who had always bowed to her before, approached the platform. They grabbed her roughly, with a disrespect no Fraserian had ever showed their Empress. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice suddenly small in the vast chamber. "The humans will not believe your lies." Noble Lozen smiled coldly. "Perhaps not, but our citizens believe us, and that's all that matters for now." As they dragged her towards the exit, Redora felt the cold handle of a weapon pressed against the back of her head. The last thing she heard was Yetter's voice addressing the communication system. "Prepare a message for the human fleet. Tell them we offer them the life of the architect of this war." Then everything went black. Redora had no idea how much time had passed when consciousness returned to her. Minutes? Hours? The throbbing at the base of her skull offered no clues. The absolute darkness disoriented her as she struggled to sit upright, her palms sinking into something cold and wet. Snow. She was lying in snow. Memory returned in fragments. The noble's betrayal, the security guards, the weapon against her head. They hadn't killed her. Then, instead, they had followed through with their pronouncement: banishment to the cold. An ancient punishment from before climate control, when being cast out meant almost certain death. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the landscape revealed itself gradually. Endless white plains stretched around her, punctuated by jagged rock formations that rose like black teeth against the night sky. No structures, no lights, no sign of civilization. They had taken her far from any settlement, ensuring she would freeze before finding help. Shivering violently, Redora pushed herself to her feet. Her formal attire, designed for the temperature-controlled environment, offered almost no protection against the biting cold of Fraseria's natural environment. Already her extremities burned with the first warning signs of freezing. She looked up at the sky and caught her breath. Brilliant flashes of light danced across the upper atmosphere, unmistakable signs of battle. The human fleet was engaging what remained of Fraserian defenses. Even at this distance, she could make out explosions as ships were destroyed, debris burning up on entry into the atmosphere. A bitter smile twisted her lips. It seems that Noble's strategy hadn't worked so well. The humans weren't accepting their sudden plea for peace, their offering of the architect of war. There was a certain justice in that, even if it meant her world might fall. "Let them suffer," she whispered, her breath crystallizing in the frigid air. "Let them face the consequences of—" A deafening roar cut through the silence of the frozen landscape. Redora instinctively dropped back to the ground as a massive object streaked across the sky. A ship, trailing fire and smoke, descending at alarming speed. It crashed behind a ridge of rocks, perhaps half a kilometer away, the impact sending tremors through the ground beneath her. The wreckage continued to burn, orange flames licking upward, a beacon of light and, most critically, warmth in the darkness. Redora stared at the distant fire, torn between fear and desperate need. A human ship meant human survivors, enemies. But the alternative was freezing to death alone in the darkness. Between certain death and possible death, was there really a choice? She forced her stiffening legs to move, each step a battle against the snow and her own failing body temperature. The distant flames promised life, if only for a little longer. As she approached the crash site, the wreckage became clearer, a small fighter craft rather than one of the massive carriers. It had carved a deep furrow through the snow before slamming into a rock formation. Parts of the craft were scattered across hundreds of meters, but the main fuselage remained somewhat intact, engulfed in flames that wouldn't last forever. Redora paused at the edge of the debris field, scanning for any sign of movement. Had the pilot survived? Would they emerge with weapons drawn? The thought should have terrified her, but a strange calm had settled over her. Death by human weapon would be quicker than freezing, perhaps even preferable. She moved closer to the burning wreckage, drawn to the life-giving heat. For the first time since waking in the snow, feeling returned to her fingers and face, painful but reassuring. She stood near the flames, eyes closing momentarily as warmth washed over her. That moment of distraction cost her. Something cold and hard pressed against the back of her head, accompanied by an ominous click. Redora's body went rigid, not from cold, but from fear. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Her breath caught in her throat as a voice, unmistakably human despite the perfect translation provided by her neural implant, spoke behind her. "Don't move." She remained perfectly still, heart hammering in her chest. "Turn around, slowly." Redora complied, finding herself face to face with a human male. He wore some kind of flight suit, one side torn and bloodied. Despite his injury, the hand holding the weapon aimed at her head remained steady. His eyes, a strange bluish-green color Frizarians never possessed, studied her with wary intensity. "You don't look like a soldier," he said after a moment. "Who are you?" Perhaps it was the absurdity of the situation, or perhaps the lingering effects of her head injury, but Redora felt a hysterical laugh bubble up inside her. Was Empress Redora of Frizaria," she said, the words strangely liberating. After a lifetime of carefully measured speech, the simple truth felt almost rebellious. To her surprise, the human laughed, not nervously, but genuinely amused. "Right, and I'm Admiral Michael Jensen of the United Earth Fleet," he said, shaking his head. "If you're going to lie, at least make it believable. The Empress wouldn't be wandering alone in the middle of nowhere during a planetary assault." "And yet here I am," Redora replied flatly, "betrayed by my nobles, banished to the cold, waiting for death. If you're gonna shoot me, I only ask that you make it quick. The warmth of your ship feels so good. Not a bad way to die, all things considering." The human, Michael, if that was indeed his name, studied her face for a long moment. "Fuck," he muttered. "If this is some kind of psychological warfare technique, it's working on me." Time passed as his face shifted from contemplative to confused. Then it settled in a neutral expression. He kept the weapon trained on her, but his fingers moved away from the trigger. "Say I believe you. Why would your own people betray their Empress?" "Because they needed a scapegoat," Redora said simply. The cold had numbed more than her body. It had stripped away any desire to dissemble or defend. "They pushed me into this war, then blamed me when your fleet appeared. They thought sacrificing me might save them." She gestured toward the sky, where flashes of battle continued. Clearly they were wrong. Michael's jaw tightened. "So you admit you started this war. Do you have any idea how many people have died?" "I signed the declaration," Redora admitted, "but I did so under immense pressure from nobles who assured me humans were a minimal threat. They needed an external enemy to distract our citizens from internal problems. I was weak. I gave in rather than fight them." She met his gaze directly. "I bear responsibility for my actions. If killing me will bring you closure, you should do so." Michael's hand tightened on his weapon. Then, to her surprise, he lowered it slightly. "I can't," he began, then shook his head in apparent frustration. "I didn't expect... Damn it!" Questions crowded Redora's mind. Why hadn't he fired? What stopped him? But before she could voice any of them, Michael made a decision. He pulled a pair of restraints from his belt and moved toward her. "Turn around. I'm not shooting an unarmed civilian, Empress or not. But I'm not taking chances either." Redora complied, feeling the cold metal close around her wrists. Michael then stepped back, keeping a safe distance between them. "We need to move," he said urgently. "The ship's power core is damaged. It's gonna explode soon." "Then leave me," Redora said, surprised by her own calm. Let me die here, in warmth rather than cold." "Not happening," Michael replied, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the wreckage. "I don't execute prisoners, and I don't leave them to die either." Redora struggled against his grip. "Please, I'd rather die here than freeze slowly in the darkness." Michael ignored her pleas, dragging her away from the crash site with surprising strength despite his injuries. They had barely reached a safe distance when the ship's power core detonated, the explosion briefly turning night to day, the shock wave knocking them both off their feet. As the echoes of the explosion faded, leaving them once again in near darkness, Michael helped Redora to her feet. The temporary warmth of the explosion dissipated quickly, leaving them exposed to the merciless cold. "We need to find shelter and high ground," Michael said, surveying the landscape. "My emergency beacon activated when I ejected, but the signal won't reach orbit unless I climb this stupid mountain." "There's nothing out here," Redora said, teeth chattering. "That's the point of banishment to the cold. No shelter, no hope." Michael pointed to a distant rise. "I need to get to that ridge. Direct eyesight to the main fleet. The signal might reach from there." "You don't understand," Redora insisted. "The temperature drops further at night. Without shelter, we'll both be dead before dawn." Michael ignored her warning, setting off towards the ridge and pulling her along with him. His single-minded focus on reaching higher ground struck Redora as foolish. This was her world, her climate. She knew its dangers better than he ever could. "If you'd used the communication equipment in your ship before it exploded, you might have reached your people," she pointed out, struggling to keep pace with him through the deep snow. "I was a bit distracted by finding an alien Empress warming herself by my burning ship," Michael retorted. "Thanks for that." They trudged onward in tense silence. The cold intensified with each passing minute, the wind picking up and driving ice crystals against any exposed skin. Michael's determined pace gradually slowed as reality set in. His human physiology, even with his protective flight suit, wasn't adapted to Frizeria's extreme climate. "We need to keep moving," he managed through chattering teeth. Redora watched him with growing concern. Despite being enemies, despite him being her captor, she found herself strangely unwilling to see him die. Perhaps because he had shown her mercy when he could have killed her, or perhaps simply because he was the only one who could uncuff her. "You're too cold to proceed," she said. "We both are. We need to find shelter now, or neither of us will survive until dawn." For the first time, Michael seemed to truly listen to her. He stopped, looking around at the barren landscape with a newfound understanding of their predicament. "What kind of shelter?" he asked, his voice weaker than before. Redora scanned their surroundings, desperate for any option. The rock formations they had passed offered no protection from the wind. The distant ridge Michael had been heading toward seemed impossibly far now. Then, in the faint light of Frizeria's 2 moons, she spotted a dark shadow along a nearby cliff face, a possible cave entrance, nearly obscured by snow. "There," she said, nodding toward it. "My ancestors survived in caves like that before civilization. It's our only chance." Michael hesitated, clearly torn between his mission to reach high ground and the reality of their deteriorating condition. "The radio can wait," Redora urged. "You can't contact anyone if you're dead." After a moment's consideration, Michael nodded, changing their course toward the cave entrance. As they drew closer, Redora felt a surge of hope. It was indeed a cave, not large, but deep enough to provide shelter from the wind and preserve what little body heat they had left. "How did you know to look for this?" Michael asked as they stumbled into the relative protection of the cave. "We learned survival skills early," Redora replied. "Before climate control, our people lived and died by the knowledge of the cold." Michael used a small light from his flight suit to illuminate the cave interior. Ice crystals covered the walls, gleaming like thousands of tiny mirrors. Despite being sheltered from the wind, the temperature inside remained well below freezing. He guided Redora to a spot against the back wall, positioning her a safe distance away from himself. "You'd better not try anything," he warned, settling down opposite of her. "I don't plan to sleep tonight." Redora couldn't help but laugh, a small, tired sound in the vast silence of the cave. "Is this some weird alien flirting technique?" she asked. Michael's eyes widened in surprise before he realized she was mocking him. "Very funny," he muttered. "I just mean, I can't trust the queen who caused so many deaths, no matter if she wants to end her life or not." The accusation stung more than Redora expected. Even this alien, this enemy, believed the narrative that she alone was only responsible for the war. "You too, then," she said bitterly. "Even you believe I'm the sole villain of this war." Perhaps it was the cold, or exhaustion, or the simple fact that she truly had nothing left to lose. But Redora found herself speaking again, words pouring out before she could stop them. "Let me tell you a story, human. Let me tell you how an empress falls." The words echoed in the freezing walls between them, visible as puffs of condensation in the beam of Michael's flashlight. The light illuminated the cave's interior, revealing crystalline formations hanging from the ceiling like frozen daggers, while the walls glittered with embedded minerals that caught and refracted the light. Despite the shelter from the wind, the cave remained bitterly cold, only marginally warmer than the deadly environment outside. Redora leaned against the icy wall, her bound wrists resting uncomfortably in her lap. The frustration that this human, this enemy, still believed the false narrative about her responsibility for the war had triggered something within her. Not anger, exactly, but a desperate need for someone, anyone, to know the truth before the end. "My mother died when I was 10. Redora began abruptly. "Far too young to take the throne. She should have been the one to teach me how to be a proper empress, how to wield power effectively, how to resist manipulation. Instead, I was surrounded by nobles who saw only an opportunity to advance their interests through a young and foolish ruler." Michael remained silent, his expression unreadable in the harsh light. "For years, I was just a piece in their games," she continued, "a figurehead who signed what they placed before me, who appeared at ceremonies they arranged, who spoke words they had written. I told myself I was learning, gaining experience, bidding my time until I could truly rule." She laughed hollowly. "But that day never came. I waited too long, became too comfortable in my ornamental role, and when our citizens began to rebel against noble corruption, when the houses faced losing their power, they needed a distraction, an external enemy." "Us," Michael supplied. Redora nodded. "Your species was perfect, newly discovered, largely unknown to our people, expanding rapidly through this sector. The nobles convinced me that a show for Zarian strength would both intimidate humans into respecting our territory and unifying our citizens against a common threat." She shifted position, wincing as the cold stone pressed against her back. "I wasn't strong enough to resist their persuasion. I signed the declaration of war, believing their intelligence reports that humans would quickly back down and our problems would be solved. Perhaps I never grew up, and I'm still the little girl who is hopeless to know how the world works." Michael stared at her for a long moment. His flashlight beam caught the crystalline structures of her white hair, creating a momentarily halo effect that vanished as he shifted position. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice softer than before. Those 3 simple words lingered in the air between them. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement, the first she had received from anyone. "Our intelligence suggests your Empress was a ruthless expansionist," Michael continued. "We intercepted communications that painted you as a driving force behind the aggression. I just read what they told me to, Redora said, her voice laced with bitterness. The nobles control all external channels. Mother would have known what to do. They fell into silence. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen landscape, a mournful sound that seemed to emphasize their isolation. What was Earth like before all this? Redora asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Michael looked up, equally surprised. You want to know about Earth? If I'm going to die in this cave, I'd like to know something about the world I threatened. Michael hesitated, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. He leaned back against the wall, his breath visible in the cold air. Earth is different from here. We have deserts hotter than anything on your world, oceans covering most of our planet, forests, mountains, grasslands. Before the war evacuated the big cities, it was overcrowded, polluted in places, but beautiful too. As the frigid night wore on, they continued to talk. Michael described growing up in a coastal city called San Francisco, with its famous bridge and fog-shrouded mornings. Redora spoke of Frizarian festivals, celebrating the brief summer thaw, when flowers bloomed for just days before the returning frost. They exchanged stories of their respective cultures, Earth's thousands of languages and traditions, Frizaria's ancient ice-carving ceremonies and thermal springs. With each passing hour, Michael's wariness seemed to thaw slightly, his responses becoming less guarded. Redora, for her part, found herself speaking more freely than she ever had. I've never been truly myself before tonight, she realized out loud. First in a noble house when I finally spoke my mind, and now here, an open book with nothing to lose. The cold intensified as the night progressed. Despite their conversation, Redora noticed Michael's shivering becoming more pronounced, his responses slower. She felt the dangerous lethargy creeping into her own limbs as well, the seductive pull towards sleep that, in these temperatures, might be permanent. We need to conserve body heat, she said eventually, the practical reality overriding any awkwardness. Michael looked at her suspiciously. I'm not trying to escape, Redora said, holding up her bound wrists, but we'll both freeze to death if we don't share warmth. After a moment's hesitation, Michael nodded and moved closer, positioning himself beside her. Awkwardly, with his weapon still within reach, he placed an arm around her shoulders. The shared heat was minimal, but made a noticeable difference. As they huddled together, their conversation continued in hushed tones, now punctuated by longer silences as exhaustion took its toll. Why did you join your military? Redora asked during one of their more lucid moments. Michael was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. My father was a pilot, he finally said. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. But also, I believed in what we stood for. I never imagined I'd end up in an actual war. And now? Now, I'm not sure what to believe, he admitted. Everything seemed clearer before I crash-landed on an enemy planet and found myself sharing body heat with their evil Empress. Despite everything, Redora found herself smiling. The absurdity of their situation wasn't lost on her. Enemy combatants from warring species huddled together against the cold, exchanging life stories as battle raged in orbit above them. As the night stretched on, their position evolved naturally, both seeking maximum warmth. Eventually, they found themselves in a close embrace, Michael's arms wrapped around her as much for his survival as hers. Their joined heat remained insufficient against the cave's brutal cold, but the warmth and surprisingly playful atmosphere of their conversation made the time pass more quickly. At some point, Redora's eyes drifted closed, the exhaustion too powerful to resist any longer. When she opened them again, panic seized her immediately. Light streamed into the cave entrance, the first rays of Frizarian dawn piercing the darkness. She had slept in Michael's arms. Her gaze darted to his face, unnaturally still and pale. Michael? She whispered, fear gripping her. Had he died from the cold while she slept? She reached out awkwardly with her bound hands to touch his face, pulling at his ear in her clumsy attempt to check for signs of life. Michael's eyes snapped open, startling her. "I'd rather have woken up with a kiss than having my ears pulled apart," he mumbled, his voice rough from the cold. Relief washed over Redora, followed by embarrassment at their position. "You're alive." "Barely," he groaned, stretching his stiff limbs. "I think parts of me are permanently frozen." A strange thought occurred to Redora. "Do humans also kiss?" she asked, genuinely curious. Michael looked at her with surprise before his lips curved into a slight smile. "Yes, among other things." He pushed himself up with visible effort, his body stiff from the night's cold and uncomfortable position. Once standing, he looked down at Redora, his expression suddenly serious. "Do you still want to die?" he asked bluntly. "Or would you like to discuss an alternative?" The question caught her off guard. Did she still want to die? Just yesterday, she had been resigned to her fate, even welcomed it as release from her burdens. But now, somehow, the thought of dying felt scarier than it had during the night. She struggled to understand why. "What alternative?" she finally asked. Michael ran a hand through his frost-covered hair. "You could potentially take some sort of plea deal with humanity, accept being judged according to human law in exchange for sharing information that could help us hold the real criminals accountable, your nobles." "You mean telling every secret that could harm the nobles?" Redora clarified, a spark of interest kindling within her. "I admit, I like the idea." "That's the general concept," Michael nodded, "but I should be honest. There's a downside." "Which is?" Michael sighed. "I don't know our laws well enough in cases like yours, but since you were an adult when you declared war and caused deaths, even under pressure, you'd likely face imprisonment, perhaps decades, even with a deal." He crouched down to her eye level. "But you'd still have a chance to fight your case in court. And maybe you'd find the words to convince a jury, just like you've convinced me, that you're not the monster they think you are." Redora considered his words carefully. Her initial instinct was rejection. To place herself at the mercy of another species' justice system seemed both humiliating and frightening. But then again, what was her alternative? Return to her people, who had betrayed and abandoned her? Resume a role she had never wanted? "I doubt your imprisonment could be worse than returning to my role as Empress," she finally said, a hint of her earlier bitter humor returning. "At least prisoners don't have to pretend they are rulers in tedious states functions." A smile flickered across Michael's face. "Is that a yes?" "It's an acknowledgement that I have few options, human," she replied, but there was no real sting in her words. "And yes, I accept your offer." Something like relief crossed Michael's features. He reached for his belt and removed a small device, which he used to release her handcuffs. "I don't know if I'll see you again after contacting the fleet," he said as the restraints fell away. "But I believe you aren't evil. And I'm on your side in this. That's what I will say in my report." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Redora smiled genuinely. The gesture felt strange on her face, unpracticed. "We should get moving," Michael said, suddenly energized. "The battle ahead seems to have stopped. We need to get to higher ground so I can contact my people and try to explain all of this." He led the way out of the cave into the blindingly white landscape. Daylight revealed what darkness had hidden, the full extent of devastation from the orbital battle. Debris had fallen across the horizon, some pieces still smoking where they had impacted the snow. As they trudged toward the ridge Michael had originally targeted, Redora felt a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear of what awaited her among humans, hope that the nobles might face justice, uncertainty about her future in an alien justice system. Michael worked with his primitive radio equipment once they reached higher ground, adjusting frequencies and repeating his identification code. After several tense minutes, a response crackled through, distorted but audible. Require immediate extraction. Have high-value Frazerian defector. Urgent diplomatic implications. As he coordinated their rescue, Redora stared at the horizon, watching for the approaching human ship. Everything she had known was behind her now. Everything that awaited her was unknown. When the ship finally appeared as a dark speck growing larger against the pale sky, Redora felt her heart rate accelerate. This was it, the point of no return. The human vessel descended with great precision, kicking up a cloud of snow as it landed nearby. Before the ramp had fully extended, before Michael could lean her toward it, Redora paused. She turned to him, her crystalline eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, her breath visible in the cold air between them, "thank you." Michael held her gaze, momentarily speechless, before a slow smile spread across his face. "Come on, Empress," he said softly, placing an arm around her shoulder. "Let's go make sure those nobles face justice." Together, they walked toward the waiting ship and whatever future it would bring.